The air in that boardroom tasted like overpriced cologne and desperation. Mason Wright was standing at the head of the mahogany table, sweating through his Italian silk tie despite the fact that I'd set the temperature to exactly 72 degrees. I'm Lucas Reed, 48 years old, and I've been running the guts of this building for 22 years. But to Mason, I might as well have been invisible furniture. Mason had that specific energy of a guy who snorts pre-workout supplements for breakfast and thinks synergy is a personality trait. He was gesturing wildly at a PowerPoint that looked like a toddler's finger painting, completely oblivious to the fact that half his charts made no sense. The Japanese investors were due in 15 minutes, and this clown was panicking. "Refill the printer cartridge," Mason barked, not even looking at me, "and grab me a sparkling water. This presentation looks like garbage, and I need everything perfect." The room went dead silent. The other executives, 6 of them in identical gray suits, shifted in their Herman Miller chairs, suddenly finding their shoes very interesting. They knew what I actually did here. They knew I had the master keys to every door and override codes for every system in this 45-story tower. But Mason was new, a transfer from the Dallas branch who'd been here exactly 83 days and thought buildings just magically maintained themselves. I looked down at my ID badge clipped to my belt, right next to my Leatherman multi-tool and master keyring. It clearly read Lucas Reed, Director of Building Operations. But to Mason, a guy over 45 wearing work boots instead of dress shoes was just help. In his world, anyone who knew how things actually worked was beneath him. "The printer isn't out of toner, Mason," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're trying to print 11 by 17 tabloid size onto 8.5 by 11 letter paper. The jam sensor won't let it feed. It's user error." He blinked like I'd just spoken Mandarin. His brain tried to process this information, but it hit the firewall of his ego and bounced right off. "I don't care about technicalities, just fix it and get the water. Do I have to micromanage everything around here?" That was the moment. The fork in the road where you either swallow your pride or decide to teach someone a lesson they'll never forget. I looked at Mason standing there in his power position, completely clueless about how things really worked around here. He was guarding that chair like it made him important, when the truth was, I controlled every breath of air that kept him comfortable. See, I learned something in the Navy that most corporate types never figure out. The guy with the real power isn't always the one with the fancy title. It's the one who knows which valve to turn when the ship starts taking on water. And this building? This building was my ship. "Sure thing," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'll get right on that." I walked out of that boardroom knowing Mason had just declared war on the wrong person. He thought he was dealing with some maintenance guy he could push around. What he didn't know was that he'd just picked a fight with someone who knew every circuit, every pipe, and every secret this 45-story tower held. Most people think buildings are just concrete and steel sitting there doing nothing. They're dead wrong. A building is a living organism, breathing through its HVAC systems, thinking through its automation networks, feeling through its sensor arrays. And for 22 years, I'd been its brainstem, keeping everything running smooth, while executives like Mason took credit for the magic. I knew that the south elevator made a subtle grinding noise between the 23rd and 24th floors because of a worn cable guide I'd been monitoring for 8 months. I knew the exact frequency to adjust the cooling tower's VFD drive so it didn't create harmonic vibrations that rattled windows on the east side. I could tell you the power factor of every major electrical load and which circuits were approaching their 80% NEC limits. But none of that mattered to Mason. To him, I was just the guy who supposedly fixed printers and fetched sparkling water. I didn't head to the break room for Mason's precious Perrier. Instead, I took the freight elevator down to B3, 3 levels below street level, to my real office. Not the cubicle Mason thought I worked from, but the central control room where I actually ran this place. This was my kingdom. 2,400 square feet of monitors, servers, and control panels that most people didn't even know existed. The room hummed with the sound of equipment that never slept. 47 monitors displayed everything from energy consumption graphs to security camera feeds. The building management system, a $3.2 million Siemens installation I'd personally specified and calibrated, showed every sensor, every valve position, every alarm status across all 45 floors. Green lights everywhere, like a Christmas tree that meant business was good. Jordan Stone, our night security supervisor, was at his usual post eating a ham sandwich that looked like it could stop a small truck. Jordan was ex-Marine like me, 12 years in before getting out to raise his kids. We understood each other without a lot of talking, which is how military guys operate. You don't waste words when you've learned that clear communication can be the difference between coming home and not. "Lucas," Jordan said, not looking up from his sandwich, "you need to see this." He pointed at monitor 4 with a thick finger. The screen showed grainy, black and white footage timestamped 72 hours ago at 11:47 p.m. There was Mason stumbling out of the executive elevator on the 40th floor, but he wasn't alone. Some woman who definitely didn't work here was hanging on his arm like expensive jewelry. She was young, maybe 25, wearing a dress that cost more than most people made in a week. The interesting part was the guest badge clearly visible on her chest, the kind that required emergency administrative override to activate after normal business hours. "Third time this week," Jordan grunted, taking another bite. "But here's the part that'll make your day. Look where they went next." He switched to camera feed 40B. My stomach started doing slow rolls as I watched Mason swipe his badge at the server room door. That room housed algorithmic trading systems worth $8.7 million for 2 of our biggest tenants. It was supposed to be locked down tighter than a submarine, but there was Mason, bringing his date into one of the most secure spaces in the building. "Tell me he didn't bring a date into the server room," I said, but Jordan was already pulling up the next camera feed. The interior view made my blood pressure spike. There they were, Mason and his companion, using the space between the server racks like some kind of private lounge. The room maintained a constant 65 degrees with 45% humidity to protect $8.7 million worth of algorithmic trading equipment, and this idiot was treating it like a hotel room. Static electricity from synthetic fabrics, body heat affecting the environmental controls, unauthorized access to secure systems, I muttered, watching the train wreck unfold on screen. One discharge from their little party and he wipes out trading data for Blackstone Financial and Quantum Capital Partners. Jordan switched to the environmental monitoring display. "Look at this. Thermal sensors show the room temperature spiked to 71 degrees that night. Humidity jumped to 52%. Your climate control system had to work overtime to compensate." I felt that familiar twitch under my left eye, the same one that used to happen in the Navy when some officer made a decision that put the whole crew at risk. The man's a walking electromagnetic pulse device, and he's doing this in the most sensitive room in the building. But it got worse. Jordan pulled up the badge access logs, and my stomach dropped completely through the floor. Mason had been using the emergency administrative override for 6 weeks straight, bringing unauthorized personnel into secure areas, accessing floors he had no business being on, treating the building's security protocols like suggestions. "Emergency admin override is for fire marshals and federal agents," I said, my voice dropping to a growl. "Not for sneaking in Tinder dates and showing off to impress them." "Gets better," Jordan said, clicking through more files. "Check out the power consumption logs. The graphs told a story that made me want to punch something. Power draw in several areas was up 23% over baseline, but not from building operations. Someone was running unauthorized equipment, probably crypto mining rigs based on the power signature and heat generation patterns." "He's stealing electricity," I said, running his own little side business on our infrastructure. "And using our internet bandwidth," Jordan added, pulling up network traffic analysis. "Sustained outbound data streams to mining pool servers. We're talking about $20,800 worth of stolen electricity per month, plus network resources." I stared at the evidence mounting on screen after screen. This wasn't just incompetence anymore. Mason wasn't just some clueless executive who didn't understand building operations. He was actively criminal, stealing from the company, compromising security, endangering millions in trading systems, and treating the building like his personal playground. That's when it hit me. Mason didn't just disrespect me. He was systematically destroying everything I'd spent 22 years building here. The safety protocols, the security measures, the careful balance of systems that kept this place running smooth. He was a virus in the ecosystem, and like any good immune system, it was time for me to activate. I walked over to my secure workstation and logged into the system most people didn't even know existed. 5 years ago, when the building ownership changed hands to some investment group in Switzerland, I'd done something smart. Real smart. I'd formed an LLC called Apex Engineering Solutions and submitted a bid for the facilities management contract. The absent owners didn't care who managed the day-to-day operations as long as the quarterly reports showed green numbers and no emergency calls woke them up in Zurich. They rubber-stamped my proposal without even meeting me. So, technically, I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was an independent contractor with specific rights written into that agreement. Rights I'd written myself after studying building management law for 8 months. And according to Clause 47B, if the building's operational integrity was threatened by tenant misconduct that could result in catastrophic system failure, I had the authority to take immediate corrective action, including terminating the source of the threat. I started building my case file systematically, like planning a Navy operation. Every unauthorized entry got cataloged with timestamps and photographic evidence. Every security violation got cross-referenced with potential liability exposure. Every instance of equipment misuse got documented with financial impact calculations. But I needed more than just security footage and power consumption data. I needed Mason to hang himself in front of witnesses, preferably the kind of witnesses who could destroy him professionally. "Jordan," I said, "I need you to maintain continuous monitoring on our friend Mason. Full documentation. Every badge swipe, every guest authorization, every time he breathes near a restricted area. You got it, boss. What's the endgame here?" I pulled up the building's automation system on my main terminal. 1,247 control points spread across 45 floors, everything from individual light switches to the main electrical distribution panels. Every sensor, every valve, every motor drive connected to a network I controlled completely. The endgame is teaching Mason Wright the difference between having a title and actually running something, I said. He thinks because his name's on an office door, he controls this place. Time to show him who really holds the keys to the kingdom. The next phase required patience. Mason was scheduled to make a big presentation to Korean investors about expanding their lease agreements. He needed everything to be perfect, needed to demonstrate his command of building operations, show off our state-of-the-art systems, prove he was the kind of executive who could manage complex assets. Perfect. Because when you're trying to prove you're in control, that's exactly when you're most vulnerable to someone who actually knows which buttons do what. I opened a new file on my server. Operation Write Down. Time to start gathering more ammunition. Over the next 72 hours, I became Mason's shadow. Not physically. I'd learned surveillance techniques that made me invisible to people like him. But digitally, electronically, systematically, I tracked every move he made through my building. The evidence kept piling up, each violation more egregious than the last. The next 72 hours turned me into Mason's electronic ghost. He had no idea that every swipe of his badge, every keystroke on his computer, every phone call from his office was being logged, recorded, and analyzed by someone who understood the building's nervous system better than he understood his own reflection. Wednesday morning at 11:23, Mason accessed the 12th floor, our small business incubator wing. This floor housed 6 startups, mostly women-led tech companies that I'd personally helped negotiate favorable lease terms for 3 years ago. They paid their rent on time, kept their spaces clean, and brought life to what used to be dead storage space. I watched through camera feeds as Mason walked through their offices with a clipboard and a smug expression, making notes. Something about his body language made my gut twist. The way he measured spaces, counted desks, calculated square footage like he was planning something. Thursday, I got my answer. Hidden in the ceiling space above the 40th floor, officially checking damper actuators, but really eavesdropping through the loose vent grate I'd accidentally not tightened after last week's maintenance, I heard Mason on his private line. "Yeah, bro, it's a gold mine down there." Mason's voice drifted up through the ductwork. 12th floor is prime real estate, and I'm housing these little non-profits paying maybe 60% of market rate. Total waste of revenue potential. My blood pressure spiked as I listened to him describe my tenants like parasites. Grace Miller ran a coding boot camp for kids from low-income families. Ashley Martinez developed accessibility apps for disabled users. These weren't parasites. They were the heart of what made this building more than just another corporate money machine. "Who's replacing them?" Mason continued. "Sterling Solutions LLC. Yeah, that shell company we set up in Delaware. Here's the beautiful part. I approve all vendor contracts as VP. You bill us through Sterling at 120%. Of market rate for premium executive services, we split the 20% overage. The beauty is nobody audits vendor relationships. I had to grip the ductwork to keep from falling through the ceiling. Mason wasn't just planning to evict my small business tenants. He was setting up a kickback scheme with some partner named Logan to embezzle money through fraudulent contracts. "What about that facilities guy?" Mason's voice got ugly. "Lucas something. Ancient dinosaur who thinks he runs the place. I'll either demote him to night janitorial or make his life so miserable he quits. Probably doesn't even have a college degree. These blue-collar types don't fight back when you squeeze them." I crawled backward out of the ceiling space, my Navy training keeping me silent despite the rage building like steam in an overheated boiler. Mason thought I was just some uneducated maintenance worker he could push around. He had no idea he was planning to destroy the lives of people I'd spent years protecting while stealing from the company that trusted him. That afternoon, I made a call to Oliver Brooks. Oliver was a lawyer who looked like a bulldog wearing a suit 2 sizes too small, but he had the sharpest legal mind I'd encountered outside the military's Judge Advocate General Corps. I'd helped him out of a jam with the fire department 18 months ago when his building's sprinkler system failed inspection, and he owed me a favor. "Oliver," I said, sliding a thick envelope across the table at Lou's Diner, "I need you to execute a hostile takeover." He opened the envelope and started reading through the facilities management contract I'd negotiated 5 years earlier. His eyebrows climbed higher as he reached the poison pill provisions I'd buried on page 50. "Clause 47B, I said. "Right of intervention when operational integrity is threatened by catastrophic management failure, combined with the vendor continuity protocol on page 73. Oliver's grin got wider as he read. "You want to assume direct operational control of the entire building?" "I want to protect it," I said. "Mason Wright is going to destroy 22 years of work, fire people who depend on their jobs, steal from the company, and turn this place into his personal ATM machine. The contract gives me legal authority to intervene when current management poses existential threat to the asset." "This is going to cost serious money," Oliver warned. "Filing fees, expedited processing, potential legal challenges." I pushed a USB drive across the table. "Mason won't challenge anything." This contains 47 minutes of recorded conversations detailing his embezzlement scheme, plus security footage of him compromising building security and misusing company resources. If he tries to fight me, this evidence goes to the FBI, the IRS, and his wife simultaneously. Oliver plugged in the drive and listened to 30 seconds of Mason's phone conversation. His bulldog face split into a predatory smile. "When do you want this filed?" "Tomorrow morning. Mason has a make-or-break presentation Friday with Korean investors who are considering a major lease expansion. He needs everything to go perfectly to close the deal and secure his position." "And you're planning to make sure it doesn't go perfectly?" I stood up and dropped a 20 on the table. "I'm planning to give him exactly what he's been asking for, complete control over the building's systems, all of them, at the worst possible moment." Friday morning arrived gray and cold, perfect weather for ending someone's career. I was in the control room by 4:30, running final diagnostics on every system in the building. 1,247 control points all showed green status, power distribution optimal, HVAC systems running smooth, security networks operating within normal parameters. Mason had no idea that in 6 hours, he'd be standing in front of the most important investors his company had ever courted, trying to demonstrate his mastery over a building whose every breath I controlled completely. The Korean delegation was scheduled to arrive at 9:30 for a tour and presentation. They were considering leasing 4 additional floors for their American headquarters expansion, a $12.8 million annual contract that would make or break Mason's reputation as an executive. I opened my automation software and began writing a simple script. Nothing malicious, nothing that would endanger anyone or damage equipment, just a little logic bomb that would trigger when Mason tried to show off his technical expertise. If user equals mWright attempts system override, then execute demonstration sequence. The sequence was elegant in its simplicity. When Mason inevitably tried to prove he controlled the building's systems during his presentation, every screen in the boardroom would display exactly what kind of executive he really was. I hit compile and watched the code integrate into the building management system. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for Mason to walk into it. Friday morning, 9:30 sharp. The Korean delegation walked into our boardroom like they owned the place, which they might after today if Mason didn't completely blow this presentation. 4 executives in immaculate suits, led by Mr. Park, whose company was considering a $12.8 million annual lease expansion that would make this building their American headquarters. Mason was already sweating through his shirt despite the perfectly regulated 72-degree temperature. He had his PowerPoint loaded, his fake occupancy reports printed, and his confidence cranked up to maximum volume to compensate for his complete lack of substance. I was standing in my usual spot by the door, but today I wasn't wearing my work clothes. Navy blue business suit, crisp white shirt, tablet instead of tool belt. Mason noticed the change and shot me a confused look, but his brain was too fried with presentation anxiety to process what it meant. "Gentlemen," Mason began, his voice echoing slightly too loud in the acoustically perfect room, "welcome to the future of premium commercial real estate. As you can see from our occupancy data, we've optimized tenant efficiency by 30% while reducing operational overhead." Mr. Park's assistant was taking notes, but I could see skepticism in their eyes. These weren't amateur investors. They'd done their homework, and something about Mason's numbers probably wasn't adding up. "Our building operates with state-of-the-art automation systems," Mason continued, walking toward the wall-mounted control panel I'd installed 3 years ago. "I can monitor and control every aspect of this facility from this interface." "Perfect." He was walking right into the trap. Mason tapped the display screen, trying to bring up the building management dashboard. Instead of the usual menu, a message appeared. "Authentication required. Please verify administrative credentials." He tapped harder, his confidence starting to crack. "Minor glitch," he laughed nervously. "These systems are so advanced they sometimes need executive override." He pulled out his phone and called down to what he thought was the IT department. "Fix the boardroom display. Now. I'm in the middle of a presentation." That's when I decided to end this charade. "I can help with that," I said, stepping forward. Mason whirled around. "Not now, Lucas. Get maintenance up here or something." "I am maintenance," I said calmly, walking to the control panel. "I'm also IT, security, and pretty much everything else that keeps this building running." I touched the screen, and it immediately came to life. Not with Mason's fake dashboard, but with the real building management interface. 1,247 control points, live power consumption data, actual occupancy figures, and most importantly, a security alert log showing every unauthorized access attempt for the past 6 weeks. "You see, gentlemen," I said, addressing the Korean investors directly, "Mr. Wright here has been providing you with somewhat optimized data." The main display switched to a side-by-side comparison. Mason's reported occupancy, 96%, actual occupancy, 73%. The 12th floor showed as premium executive space in Mason's report, but the real data showed it as small business incubator, 6 active tenants. Mr. Park's face went stone cold. "Mr. Wright, would you care to explain this discrepancy?" Mason's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "There must be some mistake in the system." "No mistake," I said, tapping the screen again. The display now showed security footage time-stamped 4 days ago, Mason accessing the server room with his unauthorized guest, followed by power consumption spikes and environmental alerts. "This is our most secure space, housing trading algorithms worth $8.7 million. Mr. Wright has been using it for personal entertainment, creating static discharge risks that could wipe out millions in transaction data." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, though I knew it was still exactly 72. The Korean investors were exchanging looks that could have flash-frozen Mason where he stood. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling up the recorded phone conversation, "Mr. Wright has been planning to embezzle funds through fraudulent vendor contracts with a shell company called Sterling Solutions, LLC. Mason's voice filled the room through the speaker system. "You bill us through Sterling at 120% of market rate for premium executive services. We split the 20% overage." That was the moment Mason's world collapsed completely. Mr. Park stood up slowly, his assistant closing her notebook with a sharp snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Wright," Mr. Park said, in a voice that could have etched glass, "we are terminating negotiations immediately. We do not conduct business with organizations that engage in fraudulent practices." Mason started babbling about misunderstandings and technical glitches, but I cut him off by pulling out my tablet and displaying the legal documents Oliver had filed that morning. Actually, Mr. Park, the negotiations don't have to stop. As of 8:47 a.m. today, Apex Engineering Solutions LLC, that's my company, has assumed operational control of this facility under the catastrophic management failure clause of our service contract. I looked directly at Mason. Mr. Wright is no longer authorized to represent this building's interests. In fact, he's no longer authorized to be on these premises. The boardroom doors opened and Jordan walked in with two uniformed security officers from the building's main lobby. Jordan's marine bearing made him look like a mountain with a badge. "Mr. Wright," I said, handing him an envelope, "this contains your termination notice, a restraining order barring you from the premises, and a preservation notice for all records related to your embezzlement scheme. The FBI will want to interview you about those vendor contracts." Mason looked around the room desperately, searching for someone who might help him. The Korean investors were gathering their materials. The other executives were studying their shoes. Nobody wanted to be contaminated by association with a caught criminal. "You can't do this," Mason whispered. "I'm the VP. I have contracts." "You had contracts," I corrected. "Now you have federal charges to worry about." Jordan and the officers escorted Mason out quietly and professionally. The boardroom door closed behind them with a soft hiss that sounded like a pressure release valve. Mr. Park turned to me with something approaching respect. "Mr. Reed, is it possible to continue our discussion with someone who actually understands this facility?" 2 hours later, I had a signed 5-year lease agreement that gave the Korean company 4 floors at honest market rates, with guaranteed building performance standards I knew I could deliver. More importantly, I'd added a clause protecting the small business tenants on the 12th floor. That evening, I stood in the lobby watching Grace Miller and her team moving back into their offices. The building's lights dimmed floor by floor in perfect sequence as the automation system shifted to night mode. Every system showed optimal status. I pulled out my tablet and opened the building management interface. 1,247 control points, all green. Temperature optimal at 72 degrees. Power consumption efficient. Security status normal. For 22 years, I'd been the invisible guy keeping everything running while people like Mason took credit. But sometimes being invisible is exactly where you want to be when it's time to teach someone the difference between having authority and actually knowing what you're doing. Mason Wright learned that day about the difference between managing a building and understanding one. Turns out, when you try to fire the guy who holds the keys to the kingdom, you better make sure he doesn't also own the kingdom. I walked to my office and opened that bottle of bourbon I'd been saving. The building hummed contentedly around me, and for the first time in months, everything was running exactly the way it should. Perfect.